The glint of metal, a jagged scream of paint, and the faint scent of cheap perfume hanging in the air like a ghost. She thought a few scratches were the end of it. She had no idea I was about to make her entire world vanish. The Tuesday had started like any other, gray, drizzly, and smelling of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. For Julian, it was just another day navigating the concrete labyrinth of the city, another shift of deliveries that paid just enough to keep the lights on in his shoebox apartment. He double-parked the battered company van, its engine rattling a weary protest, and hoisted a heavy box onto his shoulder. The address was a high-end apartment building, the kind with a doorman who eyed him with the practiced suspicion reserved for people who looked like they worked for a living. Inside, the air was different, clean, temperature-controlled, and silent, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of the street. He rode the silent, mirrored elevator to the penthouse, the box digging into his collarbone. The door was opened by a woman who seemed carved from a different reality. Her name was Isabella, a fact he learned from the delivery slip. She was all sharp angles and expensive fabrics, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe, elegant knot. A silk robe, the color of champagne, clung to her frame, and her eyes, a startling shade of ice blue, scanned him from head to toe, lingering a moment too long. "Right on time," she said, her voice a low purr that didn't quite match the coldness in her gaze. She gestured for him to place the box inside. The apartment was a minimalist's dream, all white walls, gleaming chrome and glass with a panoramic view of the rain-streaked city. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom. "Just need a signature here," Julian said, holding out the electronic tablet. Isabella took the stylus, her long, manicured nails clicking against the screen. As she signed, she leaned closer, the scent of her perfume, something floral but with a sharp, chemical undertone filling the space between them. "You look strong," she murmured, her eyes flicking from his arms to his face. "Do you do private work?" Julian stiffened. He'd been on the receiving end of comments like this before, the casual, entitled propositions from women who saw his uniform as an invitation. It was a wearying, demeaning part of the job he usually deflected with a polite, firm refusal. "No, ma'am, just deliveries," he said, his tone neutral, professional. He took the tablet back, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was cool to the touch. Her lips, painted a bold, glossy red, curved into a slight pout. "That's a shame. I have a very heavy project that needs a man's touch. I'd make it worth your while." Her gaze was direct, unwavering, leaving no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't a request. It was a transaction being offered. "I'm sorry I can't help you," Julian said, stepping back towards the door. "Have a good day." The shift in her demeanor was instantaneous. The seductive purr vanished, replaced by a brittle chill. The smile dropped from her face and her eyes narrowed into icy slits. "Your loss," she snapped, the words sharp and dismissive. She turned her back on him, the silk of her robe whispering as she walked away, leaving him to let himself out. The encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. It wasn't just the proposition. It was the casual arrogance, the assumption that he was a commodity to be purchased. He shook it off as he rode the elevator down, another unpleasant blip in a day full of them. He had more deliveries, more boxes to haul, more indifferent faces to encounter. It wasn't until the end of his shift, as he was returning the van to the company lot, that he saw it. A long, jagged scar ran the length of his beat-up, 10-year-old sedan. It wasn't a random act of vandalism. The scratch was deep, deliberate, carved with a vicious pressure that had gouged through the faded blue paint and the primer down to the bare, gleaming metal. It was a wound inflicted with malice. His heart sank. The car wasn't much, a relic from a better time in his life, a time before his business failed and his life downsized into a series of hourly wage jobs. But it was his. It was the one thing of value he had left, the one piece of freedom in a life that felt increasingly constrained. And now it was violated. He ran his fingers along the raw, angry line, and a cold certainty settled in his stomach. He knew who had done it. There was no proof, no witness, just the chilling memory of those icy blue eyes and the venom in her voice. It was a message, a punishment for his refusal, a petty act of vengeance from a woman who wasn't used to being told no. He stood there for a long time, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, a storm of fury and helplessness brewing inside him. He could go to the police, but what would he say? That he had a hunch? That a rich woman in a penthouse had keyed his car because he wouldn't sleep with her? They would laugh him out of the station. He was a nobody, a delivery driver. She was a resident of one of the city's most exclusive addresses. In a contest of his word against hers, he wouldn't stand a chance. The injustice of it burned in his chest, hot and suffocating. He felt the old, familiar despair creeping in, the feeling of being powerless, of being a bug under the heel of someone else's expensive shoe. He had played by the rules, done his job, been polite and professional, and this was his reward. He drove home in a daze, the scratch on his car a glaring symbol of his humiliation. Every time he caught a glimpse of it in a reflection, the anger flared anew. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in his small, stuffy apartment, the sounds of the city a distant roar, and replayed the encounter with Isabella over and over in his mind. He saw her smug, entitled face, heard her condescending tone, felt the sting of her dismissal. And then something inside him shifted. The despair began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He was tired of being a victim. He was tired of being powerless. She had drawn a line, and he was going to cross it. She had wanted to teach him a lesson to put him in his place, but she had underestimated him. She had seen a uniform, a delivery driver, a nobody. She hadn't seen the man who had built a business from the ground up, the man who had lost everything and was still standing. She hadn't seen the man who knew how things worked, not just the clean, orderly world of penthouses and doormen, but the messy, complicated underbelly of the city. A plan began to form in his mind, intricate and precise. It was a crazy, reckless idea born of desperation and rage. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt right. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming something he had lost, something more valuable than a coat of paint. It was about taking back control. The next morning, he called in sick to work, the first time in years. He spent the day on his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was a meticulous planner, a skill honed during his years as a small business owner. He had a knack for logistics, for seeing the moving parts of a system and understanding how they fit together. And he was about to apply that skill to a new, much darker project. He started with Isabella. A few searches, cross-referencing public records and social media, and he had a name, a history, a digital footprint. Isabella Croft. Heiress to a shipping fortune, a minor socialite whose life was a carefully curated collection of charity galas, exotic vacations, and designer clothes. Her online presence was a monument to wealth and privilege. And then he found what he was looking for, her car. A brand new, top-of-the-line luxury SUV, a sleek black beast that probably cost more than his apartment building. He found photos of it on her Instagram, parked in front of exclusive restaurants and valet stands, a gleaming status symbol. He even found its license plate number, captured in the background of a paparazzi photo. The next step was reconnaissance. That evening he took the subway to her neighborhood, a quiet, tree-lined enclave of wealth and power. He found her building and across the street a small park. He sat on a bench, hidden in the deepening shadows, and watched. He saw her pull into the private garage, the SUV's headlights cutting through the dusk. He noted the security cameras, the patterns of the doorman, the rhythm of the building. He stayed there for hours, observing, planning, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, someone with a specific set of skills, someone who operated in the gray areas of the law, and he knew just the person. The next day, he found himself in a grimy, cluttered auto body shop in a part of town that didn't appear on any tourist maps. The air was thick with the smell of paint, oil, and ozone. In the back, surrounded by the skeletons of dismantled cars, was a man named Sal. Julian had used Sal's services once before, a long time ago, for a job that was strictly off the books. Sal was a magician with metal and paint, a man who could make a car disappear and reappear with a new identity. He was also a man who didn't ask questions, as long as the price was right. Sal was a big man, his hands permanently stained with grease, his face a roadmap of hard living. He listened to Julian's proposition without expression, his small, shrewd eyes never leaving Julian's face. "You're talking Grand Theft Auto, kid," Sal said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "That's a whole different league from a VIN swap." "I know what I'm talking about," Julian said, his voice steady, betraying none of the fear that was churning in his gut. "And I'm willing to pay." He slid a wad of cash across the workbench, most of his savings, a desperate gamble on a long shot. Sal looked at the money, then back at Julian. He saw the desperation, but he also saw something else, a steely determination that he hadn't seen in the younger man before. He grunted, a sound that was part laugh, part sigh. "This better be worth it, kid." The plan was simple in its audacity. They wouldn't just steal the car, they would make it vanish. Sal had the connections, the resources, the know-how. He could get a blank key fob programmed, disable the GPS tracker, and have the car on a container ship to another continent before Isabella even realized it was gone. It would be a ghost, a phantom, a memory. The night they chose was a moonless, starless black. A thick fog rolled in from the river, muffling the sounds of the city and cloaking the streets in a damp, gray shroud. It was perfect. Julian's heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. There was no turning back. He was no longer a victim. He was a predator moving through the shadows, his every sense on high alert. He and Sal, dressed in black, moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. They bypassed the garage's security system with a device Sal had built himself. The programmed key fob unlocked the SUV with a soft, electronic chirp. The engine started with a low, throaty purr. Julian's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the leather-wrapped steering wheel. The car smelled of new leather and Isabella's cloying perfume. For a moment, he was frozen by the enormity of what he was doing. He was a delivery driver, a law-abiding citizen, a man who had never so much as gotten a speeding ticket. And now he was sitting in a stolen car, a car worth more than he could ever hope to earn, about to commit a felony that could land him in prison for years. Then he thought of the scratch on his own car, the ugly, jagged line that represented so much more than damaged paint. It was a symbol of his humiliation, of his powerlessness. And in that moment, his resolve hardened into a diamond-hard certainty. This wasn't just about a car. It was about justice. It was about balance. He pulled out of the garage, the SUV moving with a silent, effortless grace. Sal followed in a nondescript van. They navigated the sleeping city, a two-car procession of thieves in the night. They drove to the industrial wasteland of the shipyards, a place of rust and shadows, of towering cranes and the ghosts of forgotten cargo. There in the cavernous, echoing darkness of a warehouse, the transformation began. Sal and his crew worked with a swift, brutal efficiency. They changed the tires, replaced the license plates, and with a specialized tool, etched a new VIN into the engine block. The sleek, black SUV, the symbol of Isabella's wealth and power, was being erased, its identity stripped away piece by piece. As the sun began to cast its first pale, gray light over the city, the job was done. The car was loaded into a shipping container, sealed, and lifted by a giant crane onto the deck of a rusty freighter bound for a lawless port on the other side of the world. Julian stood on the pier, the salty, damp air cold on his face, and watched as the ship pulled away from the dock, its horn a low, mournful bellow. He watched until it was just a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the morning mist. He felt a strange, hollow calm. The rage was gone, replaced by a quiet, cold satisfaction. He had done it. He had taken something from her, something she valued, something she thought was untouchable. He had made her car disappear. He had made a piece of her world vanish. He walked away from the shipyard, the city slowly coming to life around him. He was just another face in the crowd, another anonymous figure on his way to work. But something had changed. He was no longer the man he had been 2 days ago. He had stepped over a line, and he knew with a chilling certainty that this was not the end. It was just the beginning. He had a feeling Isabella Croft was not the type of woman to let something like this go. And as he walked, a small, grim smile touched his lips. He was almost looking forward to her next move. He had a feeling he was going to be ready for it. Isabella Croft discovered the empty space in the garage at 10:03 a.m. She was on her way to a brunch that she was already fashionably late for, the click of her heels echoing in the pristine, silent concrete of the residence-only garage. She stopped, her key fob in hand, and stared at the spot where her 6-figure SUV was supposed to be. For a full 10 seconds, she simply stood there, a perfectly sculpted statue of disbelief. Her mind, accustomed to a world that bent to her will, couldn't process the void. Then the disbelief fractured and a hot, volcanic rage erupted in its place. A strangled sound escaped her lips, a noise of pure fury. This wasn't possible. Cars like hers didn't just get stolen. Not from this garage, not from her. Her first call was not to the police. It was to her father. The conversation was brief, clipped, and filled with the kind of venom that only familial disappointment can produce. By 10:15 a.m., 2 of the city's top auto theft detectives were en route, their morning interrupted by a call from the commissioner himself. By the time they arrived, Isabella was packing her minimalist apartment like a caged panther, a phone pressed to her ear. She was a whirlwind of furious energy, her voice a low, dangerous weapon. The detectives, a pair of weary, seen-it-all veterans named Miller and Russo, were met by the doorman and escorted up in the silent, mirrored elevator. The security footage for the garage, ma'am? Miller asked, his pen poised over his notepad. It glitched, Isabella spat, the word dripping with contempt. A power surge between 3 and 5 this morning wiped the recordings for the entire level. Convenient, isn't it? Russo sighed. Professional job, they knew the system. Of course it was a professional job, Isabella snapped, whirling to face them. Her icy eyes were blazing. You don't think some joyriding teenager managed to get into this building, bypass the security, and drive off with a brand new custom vehicle, do you? Find it. I don't care what it takes. I want my car back, and I want the person responsible to pay. The detectives spent an hour going through the motions, but it was clear they had nothing. No witnesses, no footage, no forced entry. The car was simply gone, as if it had evaporated into the foggy night air. They promised to do their best to put out an alert to check the usual chop shops. Isabella listened with a barely concealed sneer. She knew they were useless. The city's bureaucracy was no match for this kind of brazen violation. As soon as they were gone, she made another call. This one was to a number she kept in a secure app on her phone, a number she had only used twice before. A man answered on the first ring, his voice calm, cultured, and utterly devoid of emotion. Marcus, she said, her voice tight, I have a job for you. Meanwhile, Julian was trying to slip back into the rhythm of his old life, but it was like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. He went back to work, hefting boxes, navigating the city in the rattling van. On the surface, everything was the same, but inside, a fundamental shift had occurred. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been his companion for years was gone, replaced by a hyper-aware watchfulness. Every siren made his heart kick. Every police car that passed him on the street sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. But it wasn't just fear. It was something else, something akin to exhilaration. He had taken a piece from a queen, and the board was now his to play on. The first thing he did with his remaining savings was get his car repaired. He took it to a small, independent shop, and when he picked it up, the faded blue paint was smooth and unbroken, the ugly scar completely gone. It was a small, symbolic victory, an erasure of his own violation. He started paying attention in a way he never had before. He noticed the unmarked cars that idled on street corners, the way people's eyes flicked away when he met their gaze. The city was no longer just a backdrop to his daily grind. It was a network of sightlines and escape routes, a landscape of potential threats and opportunities. He was no longer a pawn. Marcus Thorne was a man who existed in the shadows cast by the city's elite. He was a ghost, a whisper, a name spoken only when conventional solutions had failed. He wasn't a private investigator in the traditional sense. He was a problem solver. For a very high price, he made problems disappear. He operated from a nondescript office in a downtown skyscraper, a sterile space with a view of the entire city, a kingdom he navigated with a predator's instinct. He met Isabella in a private room at an exclusive club, the air thick with the smell of old leather and money. He listened to her story without interruption, his face a mask of polite interest. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his graying hair perfectly coiffed. He looked more like a corporate lawyer than a man who trafficked in secrets and intimidation. This isn't a random theft, Isabella said, her voice low and intense. This was personal, it was a message. Marcus steepled his fingers. And who would want to send you a message, Ms. Croft? Isabella's jaw tightened. She ran through a mental list of business rivals, spurned lovers, jealous friends. The list was long, but none of them felt right. This was different. It was cruder, more direct. And then a memory surfaced, a delivery driver, the insolent look in his eyes as he refused her. The way she had felt a flicker of rage, a desire to put him in his place. She remembered dragging her key along the side of his pathetic little car, the satisfying screech of metal on metal. She had dismissed him from her mind instantly. He was nothing, a bug, but now. There was a delivery man, she said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. A few days ago, he was disrespectful. Marcus raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. A delivery man? You think a package courier orchestrated a high-level grand theft auto operation because you hurt his feelings? I didn't just hurt his feelings, Isabella said, a cruel smile playing on her lips. I left my mark on his property, a little lesson in respect. Marcus's expression didn't change, but a flicker of genuine interest appeared in his eyes. This was the kind of human element he excelled at exploiting. Not a professional rivalry, but a personal vendetta. A crime of passion disguised as a crime of profit. Give me his name, he said. It took Marcus less than a day to get the delivery logs from the company Julian worked for. Julian Hayes. The name was as common and forgettable as the man himself, at least on paper. Marcus's team of data miners went to work, pulling together the digital fragments of Julian's life. They found the failed landscaping business, the mountain of debt, the foreclosure. They found the address of his shoebox apartment and the make and model of his 10-year-old sedan. A picture emerged of a man pushed to the edge, a man with nothing left to lose. It was a thin motive, circumstantial at best, but it was the only thread Marcus had. He decided to pull on it. Julian was coming home from a late shift, his body aching with a familiar weariness. He trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to his apartment, his keys in his hand. As he reached his landing, he saw something on the worn doormat in front of his door. It was a key. Not a normal key, but a heavy, polished piece of metal, embossed with the logo of a luxury car brand. Isabella's brand. It was pristine, gleaming under the dim, flickering light of the hallway. Julian froze, his blood turning to ice. He looked up and down the empty, silent hallway. There was no one there, but he felt a sudden, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He knew with a gut-wrenching certainty what this was. It wasn't the police. This was something else. This was a message delivered with a chilling precision that mirrored his own. The game had escalated. He had taken her queen, and now she had sent a knight, a dark, unseen player, to his doorstep. He slowly bent down and picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in his palm. The thrill of his victory, the cold satisfaction he had felt at the shipyard, evaporated, replaced by a stark, terrifying reality. He had started a war with a woman who had unlimited resources, a woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, and he had just been put in check. Panic was a physical thing, a cold, metallic taste in the back of his throat. Julian's hand trembled as he unlocked his apartment door, the key fumbling against the lock. He slipped inside, slamming the deadbolt home, his back pressed against the wood as if he could hold the world at bay. The small apartment, once his sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The windows were gaping eyes, the thin walls offering no protection. He was exposed, a target in a shooting gallery. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, the heavy car key clutched in his hand, his mind racing. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distance was a prelude to a door kicked in, a shadow in the hallway. The message was clear. We know who you are. We know where you live. We can get to you. By dawn, the fear had crystallized back into the cold resolve that had led him to the shipyard. He was being hunted. Running and hiding wouldn't work. They had found him once. They would find him again. He had to move to disappear, but he also had to fight back. He had to find a weapon. He threw a few clothes into a backpack, along with his laptop and the last of his cash. He left his phone on the kitchen counter, a beacon he couldn't afford to carry. Before he left, he wiped down every surface he had touched, a futile gesture against a foe who already knew his name. He slipped out of the building like a ghost, melting into the pre-dawn gray of the city. His first stop was Sal's auto body shop. The big man was already at work, the shriek of a power sander echoing through the cavernous space. Sal cut the tool off as Julian approached, his face grim. "Knew I'd be seeing you," Sal rumbled, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "What you do, kid?" Julian placed the luxury car key on a stack of tires. "They found me." Sal picked it up, weighing it in his palm. He let out a low whistle. "This ain't cops, this is high-end. You didn't just steal a car, did you? You poked a bear." "I need a place to lay low," Julian said, his voice tight. "And a burner phone, I'll pay." Sal stared at him for a long moment, his shrewd eyes assessing the situation. He was a businessman, and Julian was now a liability. But there was also a code, an unspoken rule among men who operated in the shadows. You didn't leave a man stranded. "Got a storage unit a few blocks from here. It's dry. Not comfortable, but it's off the grid," Sal said, tossing him a set of keys. He pulled a cheap, plastic-wrapped phone and a charger from a locked cabinet. "Cash only. And kid," he added, his voice dropping, "whatever this is, finish it. People like this, they don't just go away. You gotta make M." The storage unit was a 10 by 10 metal box, cold, windowless, and smelling of dust and rust. It was perfect. It was a blank space, a non-place, a temporary reprieve from the feeling of being watched. Julian set up a small camp, his backpack for a pillow. Then he turned on the burner phone and got to work on his laptop, tethering it to the phone's weak signal. As he worked, the first of Marcus's blows landed, an email from his boss at the delivery company. The subject line was termination of employment. An anonymous tip, the email explained, had led to an internal investigation. They had found discrepancies in his delivery records suggesting theft. He was fired, effective immediately. His final paycheck would be withheld pending a full audit. It was a lie, a fabrication, but it was brutally effective. He was cut off, his one legitimate source of income severed. An hour later, the next blow fell. He tried to check his bank account online. Access denied. A bright red banner flashed across the screen, account frozen due to suspected fraudulent activity. They were dismantling his life brick by brick. They were isolating him, stripping him of resources, trying to flush him out into the open where they could deal with him. The fear was back, a cold knot in his stomach. But now it was mixed with a white-hot rage. They thought they could crush him, erase him like a line of bad code. They still didn't know who they were dealing with. He pushed aside his personal problems and focused on the only thing that mattered, finding a weapon. He went back to his research on Isabella Croft, but this time he wasn't just looking at her social life. He was looking at her money. He followed the digital trail of her family's empire, Croft Shipping. It was a global behemoth, a pillar of international commerce. On the surface, it was impeccable. But Julian knew from his own failed business that every clean facade has a dirty backroom. He spent hours, his eyes burning from the screen's glare, diving into the labyrinth of corporate filings, shareholder reports, and maritime trade logs. He was looking for anomalies, for the things that didn't add up. And then he found it. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail in a quarterly logistics report. A subsidiary of Croft Shipping, a company called Oceanic Transit Solutions, was listed as handling cargo logistics for a handful of routes in Southeast Asia. But when Julian cross-referenced the shipping manifests, the cargo descriptions were vague, listed under generic codes like industrial equipment or textile goods. The declared values were unusually low for the tonnage, and the destinations were small, obscure ports known for lax customs enforcement. It was a thread, a tiny, almost invisible thread. Julian pulled on it. He used the last of his cash to buy access to a private international trade database, a tool used by financial analysts and investigative journalists. He typed in the name Oceanic Transit Solutions. The search returned a web of shell corporations, registered in tax havens, each one a dead end designed to obscure ownership. It was a classic money laundering structure, a complex financial machine built to wash dirty money clean. But who was the money coming from, and where was it going? He kept digging, fueled by coffee and the adrenaline of the hunt. He felt like he was back in his old life, poring over spreadsheets and invoices, looking for the one detail that would give him an edge. He traced the transactions, the wire transfers that flowed between the shell companies. And then he found a name, a recurring signatory on several of the transfers. A name that had no official connection to Croft Shipping. The name was Marcus Thorne. The world tilted on its axis. The man Isabella had hired to find him was not just an employee. He was a partner. His problem-solving business wasn't just about finding stolen cars or intimidating delivery drivers. It was a front, a service for the darker, more profitable side of the Croft empire. This wasn't just about a personal vendetta anymore. He had stumbled into something much bigger, much more dangerous. He had his weapon. He sat back, the cold metal wall of the storage unit at his back, and took a deep breath. He was holding a stick of dynamite, and the fuse was lit. He could go to the authorities, but it would be his word against a corporate giant. They would bury him in legal fees, discredit him, or worse. No, this wasn't for the police. This was leverage. This was his countermove. He picked up the burner phone. His fingers were steady as he dialed the number for Marcus Thorne's office, a number he had found on a sleek corporate website that spoke of discrete solutions and risk management. A calm, professional voice answered, "Mr. Thorne's office." "I need to speak with him," Julian said, his own voice low, unrecognizable from the nervous man who had stood in Isabella's penthouse. "Tell him it's about Oceanic Transit Solutions." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a fractional hesitation that told Julian everything he needed to know. He had hit a nerve. A moment later, Marcus's smooth, cultured voice came on the line. "Who is this?" Julian didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. "There's a container ship," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless statement of fact. "The Star of Orion, it's scheduled to dock in Jakarta in 2 days. The manifest says it's carrying used textile machinery, but it's not, is it, Marcus?" The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Julian could almost feel the man's mind racing, his perfect composure cracking under the weight of an impossible revelation. The hunter had just become the hunted. "The game has changed," Julian said softly and hung up the phone. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Marcus Thorne felt a tremor of genuine fear. It was a foreign sensation, cold and sharp, that cut through his practiced composure. He stood in his sterile, high-rise office, the phone still in his hand, and stared out at the sprawling city below. For years, he had looked down on this city like a god, moving its pieces, solving its problems, immune to its chaos. Now a ghost from that chaos had reached up and seized him by the throat. He immediately erased the call log, a reflexive action of a man accustomed to covering his tracks. But he knew it was a futile gesture. The damage was done. The delivery driver, this Julian Hayes, this absolute nobody, had somehow burrowed into the bedrock of the Croft operation and found the fault line. Oceanic Transit Solutions was more than just a money-laundering scheme. It was the engine of the Croft family's true power, a shadow enterprise that moved things far more valuable and far more illegal than money. And the Star of Orion was carrying a shipment so sensitive that its discovery would not just ruin them, it would obliterate them. His first instinct was to activate a cleanup crew to find Hayes and silence him permanently. But the man's final words echoed in his mind. The game has changed. This wasn't a simple threat. It was a statement of tactical superiority. Hayes wasn't just holding a card, he had already played it. He had a dead man's switch. If he disappeared, the information would surely surface. Marcus's next call was to Isabella. He found her at a private spa, her voice languid and annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Marcus? Did you find him?" "He found me," Marcus said, his voice a low, urgent blade. He relayed the conversation, stripping it of his own shock, presenting only the cold, hard facts. He told her the name of the subsidiary. He told her the name of the ship. The languid tone in Isabella's voice vanished, replaced by the same brittle chill he had heard her use before. But this time it was laced with something new, a thread of panic. "How," she whispered, the word a puff of disbelief. "How is that possible?" "It doesn't matter how," Marcus snapped, his professional deference gone, replaced by the raw urgency of a co-conspirator. "He knows, Isabella, he knows everything. This is no longer about your car. He has a knife to the throat of your entire family." The silence on the line was thick with the weight of unspoken implications. When Isabella spoke again, her voice was transformed. The spoiled heiress was gone, and in her place was the ruthless daughter of a man who had built an empire on secrets and violence. "Fix it, Marcus," she said, her voice lethally soft. "I don't care what it costs, I don't care what you have to do, make him disappear, but first find out what he wants." The burner phone in Julian's storage unit rang an hour later. It was Marcus. His voice was back to its usual calm, but Julian could hear the strain beneath the surface, the carefully constructed mask of control. "You have my attention," Marcus said. "What are your terms?" Julian felt a surge of power, a dizzying sensation that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was a ghost in a metal box, with nothing to his name but a laptop and a secret, and he was dictating terms to one of the most powerful men in the city. "It's simple," Julian said, his voice steady. "I want my life back. First, you're going to call my former employer and confess that your anonymous tip was a malicious lie. You will ensure my record is cleared and my final paycheck is released. Second, you will have the freeze on my bank account lifted. I want access to my money, all of it, now." "That can be arranged," Marcus said, the words smooth as silk. "And in return?" "In return, I disappear," Julian said. "I take the information I have and I vanish. You will never hear from me again. The Star of Orion will dock in Jakarta, unload its textile machinery, and no one will be the wiser." "And how can I be sure you'll keep your end of the bargain?" Marcus asked. Julian laughed, a short, harsh sound. "You can't. But ask yourself this, what do I gain by blowing up your world? I'm not a crusader, Marcus. I'm a guy who was pushed too far. I don't want to be a hero. I just want to be left alone. You have 1 hour to meet my demands. If my account isn't active and my job isn't restored in 60 minutes, I'm sending a single email to the international desk of the Times." He hung up. The silence of the storage unit pressed in on him. He had just played his hand. Now he could only wait and see if his bluff would work. The next hour was the longest of his life. He refreshed his bank's login page every 30 seconds, his heart pounding with each click. For 59 minutes, nothing happened. He began to think he had miscalculated, that they had called his bluff and were already on their way to put a bullet in his head. Then on the 60th minute, the red banner on the banking website vanished. His account balance appeared on the screen. He was solvent again. A moment later, an email notification popped up. It was from his former boss. The subject was apology and reinstatement. The email was a masterpiece of corporate doublespeak, talking about a regrettable administrative error and a full retraction of all previous allegations. They offered him his job back with a bonus for the inconvenience. He had won. He had actually won. A wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy washed over him. He had faced the monster and made it blink. The burner phone rang again. It was Marcus. "Your terms have been met," he said. "Now we need to finalize our agreement. We need an assurance, a face-to-face meeting. You, me, and a representative of my client. We give you a severance package, a clean break. You give us the data you've collected." Julian's blood ran cold. It was a trap. Of course it was a trap. They would never let him walk away. They couldn't afford to. People like them didn't leave loose ends. "No," Julian said. "The deal is done. I'm gone." "That's not good enough," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "My client requires a more permanent resolution, a guarantee. Grand Central Station, the main concourse under the clock. Midnight tomorrow, come alone. If you're not there, our truce is over. And this time, Mr. Hayes, we won't just take your job, we'll take everything." The line went dead. Julian knew he couldn't go. It was a suicide mission. But he also knew Marcus was right. The truce was temporary. They would never stop hunting him. He had to finish it, just as Sal had told him. He had to make them go away. He spent the next 24 hours in a fever of activity. He wasn't planning an escape. He was planning an attack. He wasn't going to the meeting, but he was going to make sure they showed up. He used his newly unfrozen funds to buy a few key items: a high-powered Wi-Fi hotspot, a proxy server subscription that would bounce his internet signal across 3 continents, and a dozen disposable email accounts. He crafted a detailed, anonymous email. It contained everything he had found: the network of shell corporations, the doctored shipping manifests, the illegal cargo of the Star of Orion. He didn't just have data, he had proof. Scanned documents, transaction records, internal memos he had hacked from Croft Shipping's poorly secured servers. But he didn't address the email to the police or the press. He had a more elegant solution. His research had revealed one key vulnerability in the Croft empire: a bitter, long-standing rivalry with a competing global logistics firm run by a notoriously aggressive CEO. The two companies were locked in a corporate death match, and Julian was about to hand one of them a nuke. Midnight came. The main concourse of Grand Central Station was a cavern of shadows and echoes. Isabella and Marcus stood under the iconic clock, two predators waiting for their prey. Isabella was tense, her eyes scanning the thinning crowds. Marcus was a statue of calm, but his hand rested inside his tailored jacket, close to the cold steel of a pistol. They were surrounded invisibly by a team of Marcus's men, disguised as travelers and janitors. But Julian wasn't there. At precisely 12:01 a.m., as the Star of Orion was being guided into its berth in Jakarta, an email landed in the inbox of the CEO of Croft Shipping's biggest rival. Miles away in his cold, metal box, Julian hit send. He watched the progress bar, then shut his laptop. He dropped the burner phone into a bucket of water, shorting out its circuits. He packed his bag, walked out of the storage facility, and never looked back. He didn't see the panic that erupted in a skyscraper office downtown. He didn't see the furious, impotent rage on Isabella's face as she stood under the clock, realizing she had been played. He didn't hear the frantic calls as Marcus Thorne's carefully constructed world began to crumble. He was just a man walking through the sleeping city, a ghost who had refused to be busted. He had started a war he could never have won, so he had ended it on his own terms. He had keyed their entire world, and now it was about to disappear. The fallout was not a loud explosion, but a swift, silent implosion. Julian's email, a digital torpedo, struck the Croft empire below the waterline. The rival CEO, a man with the morals of a shark and the ambition to match, didn't go to the authorities. That would have been too messy, too unpredictable. Instead, he made a single phone call to Isabella's father, the aging patriarch of the Croft dynasty. The conversation, as it was later rumored in the hushed corridors of international finance, was brutally short. The rival CEO laid out his terms: a forced merger, an acquisition so hostile it was tantamount to a public execution. He would absorb Croft Shipping's legitimate assets for pennies on the dollar, and in return the evidence of their shadow operations, the contents of Julian's email, would be buried so deep it would never see the light of day. It was a checkmate. To refuse was to face international prosecution and total ruin. To accept was merely to face financial annihilation. The old man, cornered and broken, chose the latter. Within 48 hours, the company that had defined his family for 3 generations was gone, swallowed whole by their most hated enemy. The Croft name, once a symbol of power and prestige, became a whispered cautionary tale. Julian followed the news from 1,000 miles away, in a small, sun-drenched town where no one knew his name. He was living in a rented room, working a cash-only job at a local diner. He had a new identity, a new life, a clean slate bought with a secret. He read about the stunning corporate merger on a library computer, the dry financial jargon a pale shadow of the brutal war he knew had been fought. There was no mention of illegal shipments or money laundering, only of market consolidation and synergistic growth. The rich had their own way of cleaning up their messes. He felt no triumph, no elation, just a quiet, profound sense of release, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had survived. That was enough. The news of Marcus Thorne came a week later, a small, 2-paragraph story buried in the back of the business section. He had been found in his high-rise office, a single self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The story called it a tragedy, speculating that he had been ruined by the sudden collapse of his primary client, Croft Shipping. Julian knew better. Marcus was a man who valued control above all else. Faced with the loss of it, he had chosen the only exit he could still command. He was a loose end, and he had tied himself off. But it was the fate of Isabella that brought the story to its true, karmic conclusion. Julian found it by accident months later while scrolling through a celebrity gossip site. The headline was dripping with schadenfreude. Fallen heiress Isabella Croft hits rock bottom. Her family's fortune was gone, seized in the merger or tied up in legal battles. The penthouse had been sold, the designer clothes auctioned off. The fair-weather friends had vanished like morning mist. She had been left with nothing but a name that was now synonymous with failure. The accompanying photo was a grainy paparazzi shot, a world away from the curated perfection of her Instagram. It showed Isabella on a city street, arguing with a parking enforcement officer. She was standing next to a car, not a luxury SUV, but a dented 10-year-old sedan, a model remarkably similar to the one Julian had once owned. And running along the driver's side door from fender to fender was a long, jagged scratch, a raw, angry wound of exposed metal. The article explained, with breathless glee, that the car had been keyed while she was in a job interview for a position as a retail sales associate. The ultimate irony. The woman who had used a key to assert her power over a man she considered beneath her was now on the receiving end of the same petty, anonymous act of vandalism. She was no longer the one holding the key. She was just another victim of the city's casual cruelty, another bug under someone else's heel. Julian stared at the photo for a long time, at the furious, helpless expression on her face, a mirror of what he himself had felt on that gray, drizzly afternoon. He had wanted to make her car disappear, and he had. But in the end, the universe, in its own strange, circular way, had given her a new one. A car that was not a symbol of her power, but a monument to everything she had lost. He closed the laptop. He walked out of the library and into the warm afternoon sun. He was no longer a ghost, no longer a man on the run. He was just a man. A man who had been pushed, who had pushed back, and who had, against all odds, found a way to balance the scales. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt free. The scratch had been erased. The debt was paid. The story was over.